the unforgiving winter of 1876, a lone woman's choice defied a nation. Celine, a widow haunted by loss, lived on the edge of the world, her tiny cabin a speck in the vast, snow-choked wilderness of the Dakota Territory. One blizzard-swept afternoon, she found him a Lakota warrior, clinging to life by a thread, a man her world had taught her to fear. For 5 days, she secretly nursed him back from the brink, an act of treason in the eyes of her neighbors. But on the 6th day, she awoke to a chilling silence. Her cabin was surrounded. His tribe had come. Part 1. The Ghost in the Snow. The silence of a Dakota winter was a living thing. It wasn't an absence of sound, but a presence. It was the weight of the snow pressing down on the pine boughs, the crystalline whisper of the wind snaking through the eaves of the cabin, the brittle snap of a branch succumbing to the cold. For Celine Hayes, it was the sound of solitude, a constant companion in the 2 years since the fever had taken her husband John and left her the sole keeper of their 200-acre homestead on the unforgiving edge of the Black Hills. It was January of 1876, a year of raw nerves and simmering hatred. The ink was barely dry on the latest treaty, yet the scent of gold in the sacred Paha Sapa had already rendered it meaningless. Every westward-bound wagon train, every prospecting party that sliced through the landscape was a fresh tear in the fabric of a fragile peace. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, pushed to the brink, were raiding with a righteous fury that terrified the scattered settlers. Fear was a currency more common than coin, and a lone woman like Celine was an anomaly, a stubborn fool or a ghost in the making depending on who you asked. Her nearest neighbor, a grizzled and perpetually suspicious rancher named Silas Croft, was more than a day's ride away, and she hadn't seen him since the first heavy snows in November. Her world had shrunk to the 4 walls of her sturdy log cabin, the path to the well, and the small barn where her 2 goats and a handful of chickens huddled for warmth. The days were a ritual of survival, stoking the fire-melting snow for water, mending clothes and rationing her dwindling supplies with a discipline that bordered on religious. The loneliness was a physical ache, a cold that seeped deeper than the frost. On this particular afternoon, the sky was the color of a dull pewter bowl, low and oppressive. A fresh blizzard was brewing. She could feel it in the marrow of her bones, a deep, resonant hum of approaching fury. She had just finished securing the goat pen, her breath pluming in white clouds that froze on her woolen scarf, when she saw it. At first, it was just a smudge of darkness against the suffocating white of the landscape down near the frozen creek that marked the southern edge of her property. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A wolf. A bear roused from its slumber. She squinted, her eyes watering from the biting wind. The shape was too large for a wolf, too still for a bear. It was man-like. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her layers of clothing. Every settler knew the stories, raiding parties that left nothing but ash and blood. She scrambled back inside the cabin, her hand instinctively reaching for the heavy Winchester rifle John had taught her to use. She checked the load with trembling fingers, her mind a frantic whirl of prayers and calculations. The cabin was solid, the door barred. She could hold out. But for how long? Peeking through the small, greased paper window, she watched the shape. It didn't move. The wind whipped snow around it, slowly burying it. Minutes stretched into an eternity. No one else appeared. There were no war cries, no thunder of approaching ponies. just the lone, dark shape and the shrieking wind. A different kind of thought, a dangerous and unwelcome one, began to nudge at the edges of her terror. What if it wasn't a threat? What if it was just one person hurt? The idea was madness. The papers from Cheyenne, when the supply wagon managed to get through, were filled with accounts of Lakota ferocity. They were savages, devils on horseback. Silas Croft had warned her himself. "You see one of 'em, Celine," he'd grumbled, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "You don't ask questions. You shoot. It's you or them." But the memory of John, his face pale and slick with sweat, in the dim light of their Philadelphia apartment, his life slipping away from a foe she couldn't see or fight, rose in her mind. He had been so helpless. The stillness of the figure in the snow mirrored that same helplessness. "Fool woman," she whispered to herself, the words a harsh puff of air in the chilled cabin. She fought a fierce internal battle. To stay inside was to be safe. To go out there was to risk everything on a fool's errand. But the silence from the snow-swept field was becoming a judgment. To leave anyone, even a supposed enemy, to freeze to death felt like a sin her soul couldn't afford. She had seen enough death. With a choked sob of frustration and fear, she made her decision. She pulled on her heaviest coat, wrapped the scarf tighter around her face, and shoved a small flask of brandy and a strip of dried venison into her pocket. She left the Winchester by the door, a compromise with her own fear. Taking the rifle would feel like an act of aggression. Instead, she took a length of rope and her sharpest skinning knife. Practical tools, defensive if need be. The wind hit her like a physical blow as she stepped outside, stealing her breath and driving icy needles into any exposed skin. The snow was already knee-deep, and the trek to the creek was exhausting. Each step was a plunge into a freezing, powder-soft trap. The world was a maelstrom of white, and for a terrifying moment she lost sight of the dark shape, thinking the snow had swallowed it whole. Then she saw it again, closer now. It was a man slumped against the gnarled trunk of a dead cottonwood. He was Lakota. There was no mistaking the high cheekbones, the proud aquiline nose, or the long dark hair, now matted with snow and frozen blood. He wore buckskin leggings and a tunic pitifully inadequate for the blizzard. One leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, the bone clearly broken and jutting grotesquely through the hide. A dark, frozen stain spread from a wound high on his chest. His horse was nowhere in sight. He was barely conscious. His eyes, dark and deep-set, were slitted open, the spark of life within them faint and flickering. As she drew closer, his hand, shaking violently, moved towards a knife sheathed at his belt. A guttural sound, more a death rattle than a word, escaped his cracked lips. Celine froze, her own fear flooding back. This was it. The moment of truth. She was close enough to see the exhaustion and pain warring with a defiant pride in his face. He was a warrior, and even at death's door his instinct was to fight. She held up her empty hands, her palms open, a universal gesture she prayed he would understand. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said, her voice thin and carried away by the wind. "I want to help." His eyes didn't waver. The suspicion in them was a palpable force. She knew what he saw, a white woman, the face of the people who were stealing his land, killing his buffalo, and destroying his way of life. Why would he believe her? Thinking quickly, she knelt in the snow, ignoring the cold that instantly soaked through her trousers. She uncorked the flask of brandy. the smell sharp and potent in the frigid air. She held it out. It was a risk. It could be seen as a trick, but it was all she could offer. He watched her, his gaze unwavering. The hand that had been reaching for his knife slowly, painfully relaxed. His eyes fluttered shut for a moment, and his head slumped forward. He had fainted. Celine's heart seized. He was dying, right here in front of her. The debate was over. She couldn't leave him. To do so now would be murder. With a surge of adrenaline, she worked frantically. The blizzard was closing in the light, fading fast. She couldn't possibly carry him. She looped the rope under his arms, her fingers clumsy with cold and haste. She tied the other end around her own waist. Using the dead cottonwood as an anchor, she began the torturous process of dragging him back towards the cabin. It was a nightmare of exertion. He was a dead weight, and she was a small woman. She pulled, slipped, fell, and got up again, her lungs burning her muscles, screaming in protest. The snow bit at her face, and the wind howled its disapproval. She didn't dare look at the man she was pulling at the trail of blood he left in the snow, a grim red line connecting his world to hers. She just focused on the faint, welcoming shape of her cabin, a haven of warmth and light in the encroaching storm. It was a journey of 100 yards that felt like 100 miles. By the time she finally dragged him across the threshold, she was sobbing from exhaustion and sheer terror, collapsing onto the rough-hewn floorboards as the blizzard finally unleashed its full roaring fury outside. The door slammed shut, plunging the room into near darkness and sealing them in together. The lone woman and the dying warrior, trapped by the storm, their fates now irrevocably intertwined. Part 2. The weight of a life. For a long moment, Celine lay on the floor, the rough-hewn planks cold against her cheek, her body a dead weight of exhaustion. The only sounds were the violent symphony of the blizzard outside, and the ragged, painful rasp of her own breathing. The cabin, her sanctuary, was plunged into a deep, frigid gloom. The grey afternoon light all but extinguished by the swirling vortex of snow. The world had ceased to exist beyond these four walls. Inside them the air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the chilling reality of what she had done. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up. Every muscle screamed in protest. Her gaze fell upon the man she had dragged in from the storm. He was a heap of darkness on her floor, a piece of the wild, brutal world she had tried so hard to keep at bay. The barrier between her small, orderly life and the vast, violent wilderness had been breached. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her. But 2 years of fending for herself had forged a will of iron beneath her fear. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Survival was a series of tasks, one foot placed deliberately in front of the other. First things first. Warmth, light. She stumbled to the door, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grasp the heavy wooden bar. With a grunt of effort, she slid it into its iron brackets, shutting out the storm's demonic howl. The sudden relative quiet was deafening. It sealed them in, cocooning them in an intimacy that was both terrifying and absolute. Next light. Her fingers fumbled with the lucifer match, the scrape against the rough stone of the hearth, sounding like a gunshot in the silence. The small flame trembled, then caught on the wick of the whale oil lamp. A soft golden glow pushed back the shadows, revealing the scene in stark, unforgiving detail. The man lay motionless. His face, which had been contorted in pain and defiance out in the snow, was now slack waxen in the lamplight. He looked younger than she had first thought, perhaps no older than 25, the same age John had been. His skin was the color of rich earth, a stark contrast to the deathly pallor creeping beneath it. A web of fine lines was etched around his eyes, telling of a life lived under an open sky of laughter and hardship she could not imagine. She knelt beside him, her fear momentarily giving way to a clinical focus. She had to see to his wounds. To leave him like this was to let the storm finish its work indoors. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and reached for the knife at her belt. His tunic was a frozen, bloody ruin. The buckskin was stiff as board, and she had to work carefully, cutting away the material from around the wound on his chest. Her fingers brushed against his skin. It was shockingly cold. As she peeled back the final layer of frozen hide, she saw the injury clearly. It was a bullet wound, angry and purpled at the edges, the entry point small and neat. It was high on his right pectoral, and while it had bled profusely, it didn't seem to be bubbling a small mercy that suggested his lung might have been spared. Still, the bleeding hadn't stopped entirely. A sluggish, dark ooze seeped from the hole. She fetched the kettle from the hearth filled with water she'd melted earlier. As it heated, she tore strips from one of her own precious linen shifts, a soft, worn garment from her old life in Philadelphia, a life of gentle things that now seemed a world away. She had so little, and yet what was a shift compared to a life cleaning the wound was a grim, stomach-churning task. As she bathed the area with hot water, the man groaned a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the floor. His eyelids fluttered. For a terrifying second, Celine thought he was waking, and she froze, the wet cloth held aloft. What would he do? Would he see her leaning over him with a knife on her belt and lash out? But his eyes remained closed. He was still lost in the dark depths of unconsciousness. Working more quickly now, her heart hammering, she probed the wound gently with the tip of her knife, which she had sterilized in the fire. She was looking for the bullet. If it was still into there festering, he would surely die. Her fingers were clumsy, slick with blood, but her resolve was firm. Then she felt it, a small, hard lump lodged against a rib. Her breath hitched. Getting it out was beyond her skill. To try would be to butcher him. A wave of the same helpless despair she'd felt at John's bedside washed over her. But this was different. John's sickness had been an invisible thief. This was a tangible problem. She couldn't remove the bullet, but she could clean the wound as best she could. She could pack it, bandage it, and pray that it was enough. She slathered the area with the precious pine sap salve she kept for burns and cuts, its sharp, clean scent cutting through the odor of blood. She packed the wound and bound his chest tightly with the linen strips, her movements sure and practiced. Next, the leg. It was worse than she had imagined. The compound fracture was a gruesome sight, the jagged white of the bone, a shocking intrusion against his dark skin. The buckskin around it was soaked in blood, and the limb was already beginning to swell. Setting a bone like this was a doctor's work, a blacksmith's work even. She was neither. But she couldn't just leave it. The memory of a farm hand who had broken his leg, falling from a loft when she was a child, surfaced in her mind. She remembered the town doctor, his sleeves rolled up, pulling and twisting with a sickening crack. She remembered the splint they'd fashioned from fence posts. She looked around the cabin, her eyes landing on the stack of firewood. She selected 2 straight, sturdy pieces of split oak, measuring them against his shin. Then she sacrificed another treasure, a worn but sturdy woolen blanket John had cherished. With her knife, she cut it into long, wide strips. This hurt more than cutting her shift. The blanket held memories of him, of them huddled together during their first winter here, dreaming of the future. Now she was tearing it apart, for a stranger, an enemy. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. Gently, so gently, she straightened his leg. He didn't stir. She padded the limb with folded pieces of the blanket and laid the oak splints on either side, binding them as tightly as she could with the woolen strips. It was a crude, clumsy repair, but it was straight and it was immobile. It was the best she could do. Her work finished, she sat back on her heels, utterly spent. The adrenaline faded, leaving a profound, bone-deep weariness in its place. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The lamp hissed softly. The man's breathing was shallow, but it was steady. He was alive. She had done it. She had pulled a man back from the precipice. But as the minutes ticked by in the firelit silence, the enormity of her act settled upon her, not as a victory, but as a terrifying burden. She hadn't just saved a man. She had brought the war into her home. Silas Croft's face swam in her mind. His eyes narrowed in suspicion. "It's you or them," he had said. By choosing him, what had she chosen for herself? As she watched the stranger, her eyes traced the lines of his face, the strong jaw, the fall of his dark hair against the pale linen of her pillow, which she had placed under his head. He was not a monster. He was not a devil. He was just a man who had been shot. By whom? A soldier. Another settler. She noticed a small leather pouch tied to his belt, which had been hidden by his tunic. Her fingers itched to open it to find some clue to his identity. But she resisted. It felt like a violation. He had a name, a family, a story. A name. What was his name? In her mind, she called him Hawk. It seemed to fit the proud, fierce set of his features, even in repose. The storm raged on a constant roaring reminder of their isolation. Day bled into night without any discernible change in the grey, swirling chaos outside. Celine forced herself to eat a little broth, her stomach churning. She checked on Hawk every hour, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead. He was feverish now, his skin burning to the touch. He mumbled in his sleep his words in a language she didn't understand, the cadence soft and rhythmic, then sharp and agitated. He was fighting battles in his dreams. She sat in the lone wooden chair, the Winchester now resting across her lap. It wasn't for him. Not anymore. It was for the world outside. She was no longer just Celine Hayes' widow and homesteader. She was a woman with a secret that was breathing raggedly on her floor. She had made her choice down at the frozen creek, and now she had to live with it. For the first time in 2 years, she was not alone in the cabin, and she had never felt more terrified. The first day was over. She had 4 more to go. Part 3. A flicker in the dark. The second day was a waking nightmare, a seamless continuation of the first. The blizzard did not abate. It deepened, wrapping the cabin in a suffocating blanket of white noise and impenetrable gloom. Time lost all meaning, marked only by the shifting shadows as the lamp consumed its oil and the fire devoured the wood she had painstakingly stacked by the hearth. Selina moved in a trance of exhaustion, a ghost in her own home. Her existence pared down to a handful of repetitive essential tasks, feeding the fire, melting more snow, checking on the man on her floor. His name was Chaitan. She didn't know this yet, of course. To her, he remained Hawk, a name born of her own imagination, a label to contain the terrifying reality of his presence. He was locked in the grips of a violent fever. His skin, once merely hot, now radiated a searing heat that seemed to warm the very air around him. He thrashed in his delirium, his strong limbs straining against the confines of the splint and bandages she had applied. His muttered words became frantic, guttural cries, fragments of Lakota that rose and fell with the howling wind. He was on a phantom battlefield, fighting enemies she could not see his face, a mask of agony and fury. Celine did the only thing she knew to do. She fought the fever with cold water and dogged persistence. Over and over she bathed his face and chest with cloths dipped in snowmelt, the hiss of the cold water on his hot skin, a terrifying sound. She forced spoonfuls of lukewarm broth between his cracked lips, most of it dribbling back out, but some she prayed making it down his throat. She spoke to him in low, soothing tones, the same way she had spoken to John in his final days. The words were meaningless nonsense rhymes and reassurances, but the sound of a human voice seemed to quiet his struggles, if only for a few moments. During this long, arduous vigil, the line between them began to blur. His struggle became her struggle. His ragged breaths were the rhythm of her waking hours. The cabin grew smaller, the world outside vanishing completely, until there was nothing but the storm, the fire, and the two of them suspended in a fragile bubble of shared existence. She was no longer just his caregiver. She was his anchor to life, the only thing keeping him from being swept away by the fever's tide. Late on the second night, something shifted. The fever reached its zenith. Chaitan's thrashing stilled, and he fell into a profound, death-like quiet. His breathing became so shallow that Celine had to lean in close her ear almost to his lips to feel the faint puff of air. Fear, colder and sharper than any blizzard wind, gripped her heart. She had lost. After all this, he was slipping away. She pressed her fingers to his neck, desperately searching for a pulse. She found one, a weak, thready flutter, but it was there. She collapsed into her chair, her body trembling with a relief so intense it felt like pain. She watched him, unblinking, for what felt like hours, not daring to hope, yet unable to surrender to despair. And then it happened. His eyes opened. They weren't the unfocused, delirious eyes of the past 2 days. They were clear, aware. They fixed on her, and in their dark depths she saw a universe of confusion, pain, and a raw, startling intelligence. The air in the cabin crackled with a sudden, palpable tension. The patient was gone. In his place was a man, a warrior, an enemy. Neither of them moved. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the dying moan of the wind. Celine's hand resting on her lap was inches from the Winchester. He saw it. His gaze flickered from the rifle to her face. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering along his cheek. He was assessing her, gauging the threat. Celine's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. This was the moment she had been dreading. This was when the consequences of her choice would come due. She forced herself to meet his gaze, to keep her expression neutral, to show no fear, though her insides were a churning vortex of it. She held up one hand, palm open, the same gesture she had used in the snow. "I mean you no harm." He watched her hand for a long moment. Then his eyes traveled slowly around the small cabin, taking in the barred door, the meager furnishings, the neatly stacked wood. His gaze lingered on the strips of her linen shift, bandaging his chest, and the remnants of John's woolen blanket, binding the splints on his leg. His brow furrowed in a flicker of what looked like understanding, or perhaps just deeper confusion. Who was this white woman who tore her own clothes to bind the wounds of an enemy? He tried to push himself up, a grunt of pain escaping his lips. He fell back instantly, his face pale, a sheen of sweat on his brow. The effort had cost him dearly. His eyes closed, and Celine thought he had passed out again. But then he opened them. The defiance in them dimmed, replaced by a stark, humbling weakness. The warrior had met his body's betrayal. Slowly, deliberately, Celine stood. She moved not towards the rifle, but to the hearth. She ladled some broth into a cup, her movements measured and calm. She approached him as one might approach a wild, cornered animal, not with aggression, but with a quiet respect for its power and its fear. She knelt beside him, holding out the cup. This was the true test. Her care of him while he was unconscious was one thing. His acceptance of her help now, while he was aware, was another entirely. It would be a truce, a pact. He stared at the cup, then at her face. His pride was a visible thing, a shield around him. To accept her help was to accept his own vulnerability, to put his life, what little was left of it, in her hands. The seconds ticked by, each one a lifetime. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Finally, with an effort that seemed to take all his remaining strength, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Celine's breath escaped her in a shaky sigh. She carefully slipped an arm beneath his shoulders, lifting his head just enough for him to drink. He was heavy, a dead weight of bone and muscle. He drank greedily, his throat working the warm liquid a balm to his fever-ravaged body. When the cup was empty, she gently lowered his head back onto the pillow. He looked at her again, and this time the suspicion in his eyes was tempered with something else. It wasn't gratitude, not yet. It was something more elemental, a raw, primal acknowledgement. She had saved him. He was alive because of her. His lips parted, and a single word, raspy and low, emerged, a name. Chaitan. The word hung in the air between them, fraught with meaning. He had given her a piece of himself, a name to replace the one she had imagined. He was no longer Hawk, an abstract symbol of a feared people. He was Chaitan, a person. And in that moment, Celine knew that her life and his had been altered forever. The storm outside was finally breaking, but the true storm, the one they had just unleashed inside the cabin, was only just beginning. Part 4. The language of silence. The breaking of the storm did not bring peace, only a different kind of quiet. The violent roar of the wind was replaced by a profound listening stillness, the kind that follows a great battle. Outside, the world was a pristine, unbroken canvas of white, the sun a pale, distant disk in a sky of washed-out blue. Inside the cabin, the silence was heavier, freighted with the weight of unspoken words and the delicate, dangerous truce that now existed between its two occupants. The third and fourth days unfolded in this charged silence. They became a slow, quiet dance of necessity. Celine would rise from her chair, her bones aching from sleeplessness, and tend to the fire. Chaitan's eyes would follow her every move from his place on the floor. She would prepare a thin broth or a watery porridge, and he would accept it without protest, his initial pride having yielded to the simple, undeniable need for sustenance. The most fraught moments were when she tended to his wounds. Twice a day she would approach him with a basin of warm water and fresh strips of linen. The first time after he'd awakened, he had tensed his body, going rigid as she knelt beside him. It was a primal, instinctual reaction, the warrior recoiling from a potential threat. Celine had frozen the cloth in her hand and simply waited, her gaze steady on his. She did not speak. She let the silence stretch, letting her calm, methodical actions speak for her. After a long, tense moment, he gave a slow, deliberate exhalation and relaxed his shoulders, granting her permission. As she cleaned the bullet wound on his chest, her touch was professional, detached. Yet she was acutely aware of the warmth of his skin, the solid feel of the muscle beneath. She could see the intricate tattoo on his left arm, a series of geometric lines and symbols whose meaning was a mystery to her. She saw the landscape of scars that mapped his body, testaments to a life of conflict and hardship she could barely comprehend. In these moments of forced intimacy, he was no longer just a man. He was a story, written in a language she couldn't read. For his part, Chaitan was a silent, intense observer. His weakness forced him into a state of passivity that was clearly foreign to him. But his mind was sharp. He watched everything. He watched the way her hands, though chapped and work-worn, moved with a gentle efficiency. He watched the flicker of sadness that sometimes crossed her face when she stared into the fire, a shadow of a past grief. He saw the worn wedding band on her finger, a glint of gold that told a story of its own. He saw the strength in her slender frame, a resilience that defied the harshness of the land and the loneliness of her existence. This Washichu Wing Yang, this white woman, was not like the others he had encountered. She did not scream or shrink from him. She met his gaze with a quiet courage that was as unnerving as it was unexpected. They began to communicate in a pidgin of gestures and sounds. He would point to the water bucket, his voice a low rasp. "Mani." "Water," she would reply, pointing to it as well. "Water." He would nod, his eyes thoughtful. "Water." She would point to the fire. "Feta." "Fire," she would say, and he would watch her lips form the word. It became a quiet, hesitant exchange, a fumbling attempt to build a bridge across the immense gulf of culture and language that separated them. Each new word was a single fragile plank laid across a chasm. As his strength slowly returned, the dynamic in the cabin began to shift. On the fourth day, he managed to push himself into a sitting position, his back against the wall. His splinted leg stretched out before him. The effort left him breathless and pale, but it was a significant victory. He was no longer entirely helpless, a passive recipient of her care. He was now a presence in the room, upright and observant, and the cabin, which had felt like her sanctuary, now felt more like a shared territory. His gaze would often drift to the Winchester rifle, still resting near the hearth, where she had left it. He never made a move toward it, but his awareness of it was a constant, unspoken current in the room. It was a symbol of the power she held, a power that could be used for him or against him. That afternoon, as Celine was kneading a small, pathetic lump of dough for flatbread, she glanced out the window. The brilliant, pristine white was no longer unbroken. A line of tracks marred the snow, leading from the direction of the creek toward the woods north of her property. They were not the familiar prints of deer or the loping tracks of a wolf pack. They were the distinct crescent-shaped marks of shod horses. Her blood ran cold. Silas Croft, or worse, a patrol of soldiers from Fort Robinson, or prospectors lawless and greedy. The world she had held at bay was creeping back. Her isolation, which had been both a curse and a shield, was ending. She said nothing to Chaitan, but he must have seen the change in her, the sudden tension in her shoulders, the way her gaze kept darting toward the window. He followed her line of sight, his eyes narrowing. He couldn't see the tracks from his position on the floor, but he could read the fear on her face as clearly as if she had shouted it. A new tension entered the cabin, sharp and immediate. The fragile peace of their shared silence was shattered by the intrusion of the outside world. The questions that had hung unspoken between them now screamed for answers. Who shot you? Who is coming for you? Who is coming for me? That evening the air was thick with foreboding. Celine found she couldn't eat. She sat in her chair, the rifle now back across her lap, her knuckles white. Chaitan watched her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. Their time in this strange, suspended reality was over. He knew it, and she knew it. He broke the silence, his voice stronger than it had been before. He spoke a sentence in Lakota, a low, questioning rumble. When she didn't respond, he gestured toward his chest, then made a motion like a rifle firing. Bang! Then he looked at her, his dark eyes demanding an answer to a question she hadn't realized he was asking. It wasn't who shot me, but something more complex. He was watching her, gauging her reaction, trying to understand where her loyalties lay. Was she one of them? The ones with the guns? Celine shook her head, a small, fierce gesture. No, she whispered, her voice tight. Not me. He held her gaze for a long moment, searching her face. Then he gave a slow, single nod. It was a gesture of belief, an acceptance. In that instant, the alliance between them solidified. It was no longer a matter of caregiver and patient. It was something else. They were two people trapped in a cabin with a common enemy, the world outside, that was coming to tear them apart. The fifth day was dawning, and with it the certainty that their fragile sanctuary was about to be besieged. Part 5. The Lie Under the Floorboards. The fifth day dawned not with the promise of light, but with the weight of a verdict yet to be delivered. The sun, climbing a relentlessly blue sky, seemed to mock the gloom inside the cabin. Every beam of light that pierced the small window was an interrogator, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and the grim reality of their situation. The alliance forged in the firelight now had to withstand the harsh light of day. Celine did not sleep. She sat in her chair, the cold weight of the Winchester, a constant reminder of the world's brutality, and watched the man on the floor. Chaitan, too, was awake, his back against the wall, his gaze fixed on the door, as if he could see through the thick wood to the danger that lay beyond. The silence of the previous days was gone, replaced by a hyper-awareness, a listening so intense it was a physical strain. Every creak of the cabin settling, every skittering sound from the roof was magnified, sending fresh jolts of adrenaline through Celine's exhausted body. They had to act. The tracks in the snow were a clear threat, a signpost pointing directly at her door. Waiting was no longer an option. Celine rose and went to Chaitan. She knelt, meeting his gaze. The time for the slow, gentle dance of caregiver and patient was over. She pointed out the window toward the unseen tracks, then pointed at him, and then at herself. Her expression was a question. What do we do? He understood immediately. His jaw tightened. Using his hands, he began to tell her a story. He made the shape of a man on a horse, then held up 4 fingers. 4 men. Hunting. He mimed pulling back a bowstring hunting deer, not men. Then his expression hardened. He made a different shape with his hands, a motion of digging in the earth, of sifting. Gold. Then he mimed the rifles again. 3 of them not soldiers in blue coats, but men in common clothes. Prospectors. They had ambushed his party. He pointed to his chest, then to his leg. He had fallen from his horse, been separated, crawled through the snow until the storm and his wounds had finally claimed him. The story settled in Celine's gut like a cold stone. This wasn't about the great faceless war between the Lakota nation and the United States. This was about greed, about a few lawless men who had shot another man for the possibility of treasure. And now they, or someone like them, were circling. Chayton wasn't just an enemy. He was the survivor of an attempted murder, and she was now a witness, an accessory after the fact. She had to hide him. It was the only answer. Her eyes scanned the small cabin, her mind racing. There was nowhere to go. The loft was small and exposed the barn too far. Then her eyes fell on the braided rag rug in the center of the room. Beneath it lay the heavy plank door to the root cellar. It was a dark, cramped hole, smelling of damp earth and rotting potatoes, barely 4 feet deep and 6 feet square. A tomb. But it was their only chance. She looked at Chayton and pointed to the rug. He watched his brow furrowed as she dragged it aside, revealing the thick iron ring bolted to the trapdoor. She pulled the heavy door, groaning in protest as she lifted it. A wave of cool, musty air washed over them. She gestured to the dark opening, then looked at him. His eyes widened slightly. He understood her intent. For a proud warrior, a man of the open plains, the thought of being sealed in a dark hole in the earth must have been abhorrent. A flicker of resistance crossed his face, but then he looked at his splintered leg, at his own weakness, and then back at her. He saw the grim determination in her eyes. This was not a request. It was a command born of shared desperation. He gave a single, sharp nod. Getting him into the cellar was an agonizing ordeal. He couldn't stand, so he had to drag himself across the floor. His teeth gritted against the pain from his leg. Celine helped, taking some of his weight, their movements clumsy and strained. He lowered himself into the darkness, his face a pale mask of exertion. As she looked down at him in the cramped space, a wave of claustrophobia washed over her on his behalf. "I will come back," she whispered the words, feeling hopelessly inadequate. She wasn't sure if he understood the words, but he seemed to understand the promise. He settled back against the damp earth wall, his face disappearing into the shadows. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, Celine lowered the heavy door, plunging him into utter blackness. The sound of it thudding into place was horribly final. She quickly dragged the rug back over it, smoothing the wrinkles with a trembling hand. She kicked a little dust over the edges of the door, trying to obscure its outline. She took a deep breath, forcing her heart to slow, and went to the hearth, picking up her dough. She had to be normal. A lone woman making bread. She had not waited 10 minutes when she heard it. The crunch of boots on snow. Then a heavy fist pounded on the door. Celine Hayes, you in there?" Silas Croft. Her heart leaped into her throat. She swallowed hard, wiping her sweating palms on her apron. "Just a moment, Silas." She called out, her voice a higher pitch than usual. She took one last look around the cabin. Everything seemed normal. The only evidence of her guest was the faint, lingering smell of salve and the man hidden beneath her feet. She unbarred the door and opened it a crack, squinting into the bright sunlight. Silas stood there, a hulking shape against the snow, his face ruddy from the cold, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. His rifle was cradled in his arm. "Silas," she said, forcing a weary smile. "Good to see a friendly face. The blizzard kept you away, I imagine." "It's kept everyone away." He grunted, his gaze sweeping past her into the cabin. Saw the smoke from your chimney clear from my ridge. Figured I'd check you hadn't frozen or been carried off. Still here, she said, blocking the doorway slightly. Just trying to make this place last the winter. His eyes were sharp. They missed nothing. You've had your fire going day and night for 5 days straight. You're burning through your wood pile awful fast. It's been a cold snap, she said quickly. Deeper than I can remember. Had to keep it going or risk the pipes freezing. It was a weak lie. Her pipes had frozen last winter regardless. He didn't look convinced. He shifted his weight, his gaze drifting to the ground. See, you had visitors. Celine's blood turned to ice. No, no one, just me. Saw tracks, he said, his voice flat. Shod horse, more than one. And something else, something being dragged from the creek bed to your door. He looked her straight in the eye, his own as cold and hard as a winter stone. Looked a lot like a blood trail, Celine. The air left her lungs. She felt light-headed, the cabin tilting around her. He knew. He must know. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Her carefully constructed reality was shattering. Beneath her feet in the silent dark, Chayton waited his fate, resting on the lie she could no longer hold together. Silas took a step forward, his shadow falling across the threshold. The siege had begun. Silas Croft's accusation sliced through the cold air, sharp as ice. Looked a lot like a blood trail, Celine. Panic surged through Celine, constricting her throat. Her heart hammered painfully every choice she'd ever made, funneling down to this single, desperate moment. Her mind raced, scrambling frantically for a plausible lie. A deer would have left a carcass visible. A wolf would require proof of its death. She needed something simple, something mundane. It was one of the goats, she finally said, voice thin and brittle. She sickened in the storm. I had to put her down and drag her into the woods so the well wouldn't be fouled. It was a poor lie. She knew it instantly. She only had 2 goats. Silas knew that. He regarded her skeptically, eyes narrowed in suspicion. A goat, he drawled slowly, disbelief dripping from his voice. Then explain the horse tracks, or have your goats learned to wear shoes? Before Celine could respond, Silas pushed past her into the cabin, a large, invasive presence filling the small space with menace. He studied the disturbed rug, the scent of pine sap salve in the air, and the extra cup by the hearth. A knowing smile twisted his mouth. "You've been mighty busy for a grieving widow," he said softly. "Looks more like you've been nursing someone." He moved purposefully toward the rug covering the cellar door. Terror jolted through Celine, and she opened her mouth ready to scream, beg, or confess anything to stop him. But before any sound escaped, another distant noise reached their ears, a muffled rhythmic thudding steadily growing louder. The sound of horses' hooves pressing through deep snow. Silas halted abruptly, turning pale. Celine followed his gaze out the window and felt her breath stop in awe. Warriors on horseback emerged silently from the tree line, materializing slowly like apparitions, their dark silhouettes stark against the snow. One by one they formed a wide, solemn circle around the cabin, their faces grave but peaceful. Not warriors painted for war, but men quietly searching. A muffled thump from below shattered the fragile silence. Chayton had heard them signaling desperately from the cellar. Silas whirled around, rage and fear contorting his features. He raised his Winchester, aiming directly at the concealed cellar door. "He's down there, you lying traitor!" "No," Selene screamed, lunging between Silas and the rug, spreading her arms protectively. "Don't you dare, Silas!" For an endless heartbeat, they faced each other, suspended between two worlds. Outside, the circle of Lakota watched silently. Inside, the fragile peace Selene had crafted hung by a thread. She met Silas's hateful glare, then glanced again at the warriors, their quiet, expectant patience clear even from afar. Her choice, she realized with painful clarity, was already made. Defiant and resolute, she fell to her knees, shoved the rug aside, and wrenched the trapdoor open. The cellar flooded with daylight, revealing Chaitan's grim, determined face, braced for death. Outside, a warrior called sharply, "Chaitan." The tense atmosphere broke instantly. A tall figure dismounted gracefully, approaching the cabin with authority and quiet dignity. At the threshold, he paused, taking in the scene, Silas with rifle raised, Selene kneeling protectively beside the cellar, and Chaitan injured but alive. He noted the clean bandages on Chaitan's wounds, the careful splinting of his leg, and recognition flickered across his stern face, followed swiftly by gratitude and understanding. His gaze softened visibly when it fell upon Selene, and in a brief exchange of looks he acknowledged her courage and sacrifice. He nodded solemnly, a gesture of deep respect and profound gratitude. Quietly, he spoke a command. Two warriors stepped forward, gently lifting Chaitan from the cellar with reverent care. Supporting him, they helped him outside and placed him carefully onto a waiting horse. The surrounding warriors parted silently to allow passage. From the horse, Chaitan looked back once more, eyes meeting Selene's. He raised his hand in salute, not a farewell, but an acknowledgement of profound respect. And then silently he was gone, swallowed by the snowy forest, his people following, like shadows fading into white silence. Silas' rifle lowered, stared blankly after them, confusion and disbelief etched deeply into his weathered features. He glanced at the empty cellar, then back to Selene, mouth opening wordlessly, before closing in defeat. Without another word, shoulders sagging, he trudged from the cabin, vanishing slowly into the vast whiteness of the snow-laden woods. Selene stood in the cold doorway, alone once more, breathing deeply in the silence that followed. But this silence was different. It was vast, rich with meaning. Her isolated world had expanded irrevocably, changed by her choice. In a place where war might have erupted, she had chosen peace, bridging two worlds with courage and compassion. She looked out at the tracks left behind, in the snow, remnants of warriors and frightened settlers alike. Her cabin was quiet again, yet it echoed with the powerful memory of what had happened here. In the unforgiving wilderness, Selene knew she had achieved something rare and precious, peace forged in compassion and bravery, a victory far greater than any battlefield. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey into the heart of the Old West. The story of Selene and Chaitan is a powerful testament that true courage isn't about fighting, but about choosing compassion in a world consumed by hatred. It's a reminder that even in the most hostile of times, a single act of humanity can build a bridge across any divide, defying the expectations of an entire generation. If this story of bravery and unlikely connection moved you, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who appreciates tales of the unwavering human spirit. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next story from the pages of history. We're honored to have you in our community. Until next time.